Well, it's me again. Uh, I decided to go ahead and do something more with Soul Care with Stevie Boy. We finished the book of Philippians, and I thought, well, that's probably enough. It's pretty much all I can stand of me. And then, well, I got bored. So if you're joining me for the first time for Soul Care with Stevie Boy, I'm honored by that, and I'm always humbled that anybody would want to check it out. And if anybody gets any valuable help from it, then I'm doubly honored. And if you've been here before and you've come back, well, wow, you probably should get a medal of some kind. I decided that what I wanted to do was let's start with a book, another short book out of the New Testament, and one that I think has tremendous relevance to where we are today, as a culture, as a world, just anyway. Which, by the way, if you can find a book in the New Testament that doesn't have that relevance, let me know, because so far, all of them have for me. I've chosen First Peter. I don't think First Peter gets studied, preached about, talked about very much in our world, especially in our religious world. And the reason is because it deals with a distasteful subject, the subject of suffering. I'm going to throw some rocks here, and if I hit somebody that you care deeply about, then sorry, not sorry. Here's my thing. I think even in the church, we've become so committed to our own comfort that we have lost track of the whole picture of the broadest realities of what does it mean to follow Jesus. You see, we've come through many decades now in the United States of where the worst thing that's happened to us is we couldn't quite get everything we wanted in the way we wanted it at the time we wanted it. We don't know anything about persecution. Now there's violence, there is injustice, there is as I'm recording this, we're on the what I hope is the waning side of riots over injustice and demonstrations that now we hope and pray have become peaceful in their nature. That exists. I'm not denying that. But pretty much everybody who's going to tune into this, we don't know what persecution is. We only know inconvenience. In Peter's day, persecution was not just inconvenience. We're talking about century one. When Peter wrote his two letters, what we have as 1st and 2nd Peter, he didn't intend to write a book. He intended to write a letter of encouragement and, in some ways, prophecy to his brothers and sisters, his friends, his loved ones in God's church. This was, most scholars believe this was around AD 64, maybe 65. Which may ring a bell to you if you studied through Philippians and started at the beginning with us. It was within a couple of years of that, earlier, that Paul wrote Philippians. There was the 60s, not the 1960s, the aught 60s, was an incredible decade of explosive expansion of the church in the known world. It traveled faster than it should have, given the fact that, think about century one, how easy was it for information to travel? Well, it was difficult, especially if you went outside of your village, let alone outside of your country. It was very difficult. There was no mass communication. Everything was by the written word or by word of mouth. And if it was by written word, then it had to be transported somehow. And if it was by word of mouth, it had to be disseminated in some fashion. The fact that the gospel spread as quickly as it did in the 60s is a huge testimony to God's design and desire to see all men come to know him. Well, Peter writes, most scholars believe, from Rome, though not imprisoned, not yet. His imprisonment came at the end of his life, which was still another 2 or 3 years to come. A lot of scholars believe what tradition has, that Peter was crucified in Rome, but he requested to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel like he deserved the honor of being crucified in the same manner as Jesus. Peter knew what it was like to be more than inconvenienced. In 65 AD, the Caesar of Rome was Nero. Well, you don't have to have much background in ancient history, Roman history, for that name to ring a bell. Nero was, in a word, he was just awful. He was selfish. He was conceited. He was a megalomaniac, probably a narcissist. He fiddled while Rome burned. Remember that phrasing. Whether he literally did or not, I can't say. I don't think any scholar can. But what we do know is that the evidence points strongly to the fact that he had portions of Rome set afire because he wanted to cleanse that area, clear that area, and build more buildings to his own honor. And it seemed easy to make Christians the scapegoat, so he blamed Christians for setting the fires that he himself had set. And this set off quite a persecution of Christians, not inconveniences. Again, I'm going to keep coming back to that a lot because we have this blurred distinction in our minds, I'm convinced. This was where they were physically arrested, harmed, put to death. Nero was famous for throwing Christians to the lions. He would often execute atrocities on Christians for his own and for others' entertainment. He was not the kind of ruler that anybody would be proud to have. Interestingly, neither Paul nor Peter asked for a revolt against the ruler. We're probably going to come back to that a little bit, but just realize Nero was simply horrible. In politics, he was skilled as a politician, and his number one tool was murder, and his number two tool was deceit. You cannot read the history of Rome and not single Nero out as one of the most despicable of its emperors. Well, that's the culture Peter was in, and that's the culture that he was writing to when he wrote this letter to the church that he loved. And that's where we're going to start. We'll start with chapter 1, verse 1. Excuse me. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. In our letters, the last thing we do is identify the sender, right? Yours very truly, or wishing you were here, and then your name at the end. Well, in ancient letter writing, you identified yourself at the very beginning. It's as though you could almost put "from" before this first word of the NIV rendering of verse 1, chapter 1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. You remember Peter's story, right? Peter was the guy, so many others have said this, but it's so very true. Peter was the one disciple who most suffered from the hoof and mouth disease. Peter had a size 8.5 narrow mouth. His foot was always in it. He often spoke without thinking, and sometimes if he was thinking wrongly. He's the disciple who rebuked Jesus because Jesus had said he was going and was going to offer his life, going to be sacrificed, was going to be killed. And Peter said that we're never going to let that happen. And this is the point where Jesus looked at Peter and said what every follower of Jesus wants to hear. Get behind me, Satan. This is the Peter who, in the Garden of Gethsemane, had fallen asleep 3 times as Jesus was praying. And when he woke up the 3rd time, the mob that had come to arrest Jesus was there. He drew his sword and he hacked away. I have a friend who says he cut off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest, but only because he missed his aim. He intended to slice him right down the middle of his skull. I don't know what his intention was, but that was the Peter. He was impulsive. I would even say he was emotionally impulsive, both for good and for not so good. This is Peter who 3 times denied Jesus around the fire, waiting outside the palace of the high priest and later the palace of Pilate, while Jesus was going through his kangaroo court. This is the Peter who, after his 3rd denial, he heard the rooster crow, and the Gospels say Jesus made eye contact with him, and Peter went away and wept bitterly. This was a man with tremendous flaws. This was a man who knew what it was like to hurt deeply and to be hurt deeply. He was a fisherman. He was a blue-collar guy. He had no, that we know of, formal education. He certainly hadn't been educated as an orator. And yet, on the day of Pentecost, it was Peter that God chose to preach the first gospel sermon. And as a result of his preaching, and more than his preaching, the movement of the Holy Spirit, 3,000 men and women were baptized and became part of the first church in Jerusalem. This is Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. Apostle is an interesting word, and we have rightfully given it to the 12. You could even say to 14. And I think I can make a case that here's where I get that number. The original 12 apostles, and then you have to take out Judas because he killed himself after betraying Jesus, and then you have to add in Matthias, and then you have to also add in the apostle Paul, who said, I'm an apostle born out of season. And Paul even talks about Timothy as being an apostle. An apostle means one set apart. And when there's several layers to this in the book of Acts, when the apostles were deciding who to select to replace Judas as one of the 12, part of their criteria is that they would have been with Jesus for the whole time. There are things about the term apostle that are very narrow, and so I feel like there are no more apostles in that early first century sense. Now, are there others of us, maybe every believer, that is set apart, called out, uniquely invested in? Yeah, on that level, all of us are apostolic, but I don't think that term should be applied to everybody broadly. Peter, an apostle, not the apostle, an apostle of Jesus Christ. Well, next time we get together, we're going to dive into some pretty choppy and deep theological waters. And I'm going to tell you what I think is a reliable way of interpreting a thorny passage. And I hope you'll join me for the next step of our journey in the book of 1 Peter on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.